Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to be able to introduce Josh Gubler for our seminar or our lunch today. So Josh has been at BYU for seven years now. He is an associate professor of political science, and he's also has a strong association with the Middle East Studies program in the Kennedy Center. Josh's research studies aggression. So it studies the micromotives and psychology of aggression. He has applied this specifically in the area of Middle Eastern politics, the Arab-Israeli conflict, but he applies the same the things he learns to American politics, as well as, say, business ethics. So under what circumstances do we expect intergroup aggression and interpersonal aggression? So he uses a wide variety of methods, including interviews, experiments, statistics, and such. As I mentioned before, his primary expertise is in Middle Eastern politics, but he applies it in many different places. In political science department, he teaches classes on, of course, Middle Eastern politics, also experimental methods, and the least popular class in the university, political science 328, statistical analysis. But somehow, Josh manages to make the students like that class, as opposed to me, who's taught it for 20 years, and still can't manage to get the students to like it as much as they like Josh's class. Josh was recently awarded one of the College Teaching Awards, which is why we've asked him to come and speak with us today to share some of his insights with the rest of us. Please join me in welcoming Josh Gubler.
Great. Well, thank you for coming. I first realized I was nervous about this, which is unusual for me when it comes to teaching, right? When I stepped out of the shower and stood in front of my closet, and instead of taking 30 seconds to dress myself, I stood there and pondered. Right? I looked at my shirts, which are mainly just blue shirts and one white shirt, and black pants, and thought, well, the stripes on that, are those too formal or are they not? Right? And I went back and forth, and my wife walked in and said, "What are you doing?" Right? That was my first sign that I was just a little bit nervous. Mainly nervous, right? Because I'm teaching or holding a discussion with a group of colleagues like yourselves, who are much more accomplished in many ways than I am in a whole host of things. And so I look forward to the discussion we'll have, and hope that what I have to say is important. So I've spent a lot of time debating what I should say today. The initial thoughts that came to mind were my thoughts on PowerPoints, which I despise, but why I still use them. Or why I make all the components of my lessons fungible, meaning that I can teach them sitting here and lecturing, or in groups. That way it allows me, or having the students get into groups, allowing me to manage the energy of the classroom, which I think is important. I thought, well, maybe I could talk about that. Maybe I could talk about how people only really learn when they do or say something, and hence the importance of an active classroom. I considered talking about the 3 types of questions to avoid like the plague. I think we all know those probably, right? And I also considered just selfishly simply asking for your best teaching practices and learning from you and gathering them, and then as a service, like, putting them on some college-wide email. That would have been really nice. Maybe I should reconsider that. But my initial thought, in other words, was to spend 45 minutes, which is I think what we have here, discussing best practices, classroom strategies, approaches, methods to maximize student learning. But as I thought about the best teachers and leaders in my life, and I believe good teaching is at the core of good leadership, I realized that I couldn't actually pin down best practices that they followed universally. There weren't any. There weren't any patterns, right? I'm trained to look for patterns. I'm a social scientist. I couldn't find it, right? Some of the most impactful teachers of my life asked the 3 plague questions routinely, right? And others have lectured heavily with PowerPoint. It became clear that best practices alone don't make best teachers. If only it were that simple, right? If we could say, well, ask these types of questions and go into groups at this point or that, and you'll be a fantastic teacher. It's not. So what I tried to do was think about something much more fundamental that does separate the best from the rest. That's what I want to discuss today. Right? As I noted in my lecture title, I think the fundamental practice that separates our best teachers from the rest is their ability to speak to elephants. Now, a few of you asked for clarification on that title, perhaps worried that as a political scientist I might be talking about political elephants. I'm not. Don't worry. There will be no overt mention of political topics here. Actually, there will be, but hopefully in a non-political way, since I am a political scientist. Right? To give you a sense for the elephants of which I speak, and to which I think we must speak compellingly if we're going to be good teachers, I want to begin with 3 short thought experiments for you. This is a type of thing that my colleague Ryan Davis would do, right? But he would do it much better than I'm going to do it right now. So the first thought is this. On the Kavanaugh hearings. So this is a little political, isn't it? Right? If you're honest with yourself, you, like me, will likely recognize that you already knew, or to be more correct, you intuitively felt, whether Kavanaugh was guilty before either he or Blasey Ford testified. Is that true? And if you watch the testimonies, every last word of them like I did. Anyone else do that? That's because I'm a political scientist, right? Then you likely found yourself finding a multitude of clear evidence in favor of the original verdict. As I interviewed people in preparation, actually, for this lecture on this particular topic, right, it became clear that people had done just that. Didn't you notice how angry he was, some people would say, or how inconsistent she was, the same statements over and over. Same evidences, but never together, right? Never together. There was clearly motivated reasoning going on here. Thought experiment number 2. If you're honest with yourself, when Elder Oaks stood up to speak at the start of the last general conference, you already knew or felt that you agreed or disagreed with his message before he began to speak. Is that true? Why? Okay. Thought number 3. When students enter Poly 328, which is this required statistical analysis class, the least liked class, certainly in our major, perhaps in the college, I don't know. They already know that they hate it and that it will ruin their lives. They've pre-written obituaries for the semester, right? They sign off of all of their social media accounts and say, if I survive this, you'll see me in 4 months. And by the end of the semester, often their worst nightmares have come true. Why? I suggest the answer to all of these questions has to do with the inner workings of the largest part of our brains, the part that subconsciously processes information, the part that Jonathan Haidt often calls the elephant. How many of you are familiar with his elephant and rider analogy? I want to see by raise of hands. Oh, I thought it was going to be like most of the room. Oh, okay. Well, how many of you who are familiar with it like it? Okay, about the same number who are familiar with it. While I don't think he gets everything right, I find the metaphor useful. And his account is very similar to that provided by scholars of affective intelligence. Have you heard of affective intelligence? Motivated reasoning. Any motivated reasoning people in here? Right. Dual process models of cognition in psychology. The work on empathy by people like Lisa Feldman Barrett and others, right? What I find actually is that a lot of people are telling the same story. They have different variations on the details. But there's a lot of evidence pointing in the direction of the existence of this elephant in our brain and how it processes information. Let me tell you a little bit about how Haidt talks about it. He suggests that the elephant, this subconscious part of our brain, does nearly all of our processing and decision making. And that it does so by drawing on a set of associations, typically from past experiences, right? Each accompanied by what some call low-level affect, others call intuitions, but I'll just call low-level emotion. We have some sort of a memory, and that memory is attached to an emotion. I'll tell you a little bit later about myself and apple pie, for example. Research suggests that these low-level emotions are typically just distinguishable by valence. They're either positive or negative, right? It's only once we aggregate up and the writer, who comes in later in our story, begins to think about these emotions that we actually put names to them and complexify them. At the base level, we have memories, associations, and we have emotions, right? When we receive some new stimulus through our senses, the elephant processes this information, right? How does it do it? By linking it to the associations. And the resulting combined emotion gets the elephant to lean, so to speak, either favorably or against that piece of information. I think we can recognize all of us doing this, right? The information is instantly fed to the rider. So we've just talked about the elephant. Okay, the rider is the small portion of the brain that we know very well. It's the conscious, rational, I'm going to put that in air quotes here, part of the brain. Which Haidt will say more often than not just provides justifications for the direction the elephant has already decided the two of them will go. Okay? And Haidt provides a bunch of compelling evidence to show that education actually doesn't increase the power of the rider, it just increases the eloquence of his or her justification. Right? He talks about the rider as a PR firm. Now, does the rider, this conscious, rational part of the brain, ever override the elephant? Sure. Right? But just about as often as you might expect a rider on a real elephant to override the direction of that elephant, right? It happens rarely. And much less often than we typically want to think about as Western educated elites, right, who like to draw this Aristotelian distinction between pathos and logos and logos and so on and so forth, right? So if I were at a psychology conference, any psychologists in here, right? What I would just say is, for point number one, is that all cognition is hot cognition. Now that's debatable, but that's the key first insight to helping us understand. So we've talked about this elephant. We've talked about the rider. Now, point number two is that that emotion generally is for doing. Emotions create what scholars call action tendencies, or if you're in the motivated reasoning tradition, you just call them emotions create motivation. Okay? That's what emotion is designed to do, is to create motivation. If I feel something for someone, I have approach motivation or avoidance motivation, if not. If I feel favorably towards something, then I'm willing to consider it more, so on and so forth, right? Emotions for doing. I, for example, don't eat sweets. But there's something about apple pie that gets me every time. I just have to have it. When I think about it, more deeply, I realize that it's a bunch of those associations. When I think of apple pie, I think of my mom in an apron at the table and the conversation we had. I think of my daughter and so on and so forth, right? I have an emotional attachment there. And it motivates me towards eating it, even if I'm on a no-sweets diet, which I normally am. So point number one is that there's an elephant and that all of our cognition is processed through these low-level emotions generated by associations that have been formed that are different for all of us and that are interconnected. Point number two is that this emotion creates motivation. Point number three is that individuals are most likely to act, to change, or to learn. Here's where we're going to tie this into teaching. When those low-level emotions push in the same direction. Okay, if I've got all positive affect pushing one direction, then I'm more likely to act on that particular piece of information than I am if I've got some positive and some negative. And certainly if I have all negative, right? When we have conflicting action tendencies, we tend not to act. The elephant stalls. When they're pushing in the same direction, we have motivation for learning and for change. Now, how does this help us understand these 3 points? Hot cognition, emotion is for doing, and action in the case of unified emotion. How does it help us understand our 3 thought experiments? Kavanaugh, Oakes, and Poly 328. Well, the Kavanaugh case, right? People have different set of past associations, right? And those different associations generated from past experiences, generated from research experience, generated from conversation with so-and-so and so-and-so create affect that get our elephants leaning in one direction or another, which predispose the rider to find what the elephant expected. The elephant had started down the path, and the rider found evidence for it, the evidence the type of which I've given you. With Elder Oakes, I think it's exactly the same thing. He's just one example. All right? With my Poly 328 class, or any other class, it's the same thing. What we're interested in doing as teachers is motivating change. That's what learning is, right? And what I would suggest is that if we're going to do that successfully, we have to somehow speak to their elephants, not just appeal to the rider. Okay? Addressing the associations that are there in their brains that are preventing learning, right? Appeals to the rider alone are likely to have little effect. In fact, in some of my experiments, I show that appeals strictly to the rider typically generate a backlash effect because you're often triggering different associations inside of people that work against the very purpose that you've designated. I run experiments where I humanize members of dehumanized groups for people and show that people who have deeply negative associations in their elephant actually respond with greater aggression to those humanizing appeals than people who don't. I think this is the fundamental difference between good and great teachers. The great teachers find ways to convince the elephants, not just the riders, that they deeply want what's being offered. Okay? Now, I think that consciously trying to speak to the elephants in our students' heads, or in our hearts, I guess we might say. Here we're talking about heads in particular, is actually what will help us bring up the middle of our classrooms, which has been my rallying cry for some time. I think it's fine to teach the 10% of our students at the very top who are very easy to teach and feel great about our efforts there. But that I personally need to make a lot more efforts to reach the middle of the distribution. And I think the key difference, perhaps the only key difference between that top 10% and the middle is the state of their elephants. The top 10% have all the motivation and with it the confidence to go and learn. The middle 10%, their associations, particularly dealing with stats, for example, are mixed, right? There was that lousy math high school teacher, right? There was the time that they failed the AP test. There was that conversation around the dinner table where their family said, but it turns out we're not math people, so on and so forth, right? all mixed in with hopefully some positive associations, right? And I think that our middle students are a set of students who do not differ in ability from the top 10%. I think they differ in motivation, which translates later on into difference in performance, and thus perceived difference in ability, and so on and so forth, over time, right? So, I think our task is to speak to the elephants in those students' heads and at least shift them to a neutral position, if not towards a favorable position. Get them to lean. And one of the main things that I notice the best teachers doing is taking the time to do that. The start of every lesson, in the middle of a lesson, taking the time to speak to those elephants. And I'm convinced that even though it takes extra time to do this, that if you can get those elephants leaning your direction, then you can easily cover the time you lost in terms of progress with those students. So, let me give you an example of what this looks like when I'm teaching 328, as Jay has talked about. And I'm interested in your thoughts and reactions to this. What do you suppose are the associations and the connected emotions that political science students entering our statistical analysis class have in their heads? Positive and negative. What are they?
Why do I have to take this class?
Right. Right.
Well, like, I don't know how to read a regression table or whatever, that they've had to read articles before and it never made sense.
Right. I've done this, yeah. Negative affect there, negative emotion for sure. Right.
Picked this major so I didn't have to do math.
Right, I picked this major so I didn't have to do math. And why? Well, I've been running from math for as long as I can. Right? Other things.
I'll never use this.
I'll never use this, right? It's worthless. What's the preponderance of affect we've just covered there? Pretty negative, right? So before I walk into that room and even open my mouth, those elephants are leaning the opposite direction, right? Absolutely, the opposite direction. And until I get those elephants to lean the other way, all they are likely to see is confirming evidence. You ever taught a class like that? Right? Where everything you did was confirming evidence, to the negative side of things, right? And then he did this, right? And then he said that, and it was really meant as a personal slight, and then and he assigned this because so on and so forth, right? You've got a bunch of those. Like I've said, you've got some math. You've got real negative associations with math in political science. You have negative associations with, friends. For 328 in particular, there's kind of like a culture of being a 328 survivor. Once you're a survivor, you go out and you tell these stories. You've seen this, right, Jay? They go out and they build up these stories and say, I was working 80 hours a week on that thing, and yeah, you've heard of it in the elevator, right? I lost my faith over this class, and I broke up with my girlfriend, and so on and so forth. Which, when we actually talk with them, is not true. But those are the stories that get told, right? And so people walk in with those associations, all of that, with past experience and so on and so forth in their heads. If I stand up on day one and say probability theory is fantastic, right? Where do we go? He wants that because it's painful for me, right? He hates me, and so does probability theory generally. Right? So what do? Well, I I do a bunch of different things, right? And I'm interested in your thoughts after this about what you do, because I'm sure you do this directly, right? Now, I think a lot of us actually don't. We just try to stand up and start appealing to the writer, right? It doesn't work. What do? I spend the entire first class period telling stories, which seems like a waste of time, unless you're convinced that learning's only going to happen once the elephants have leaned. I tell stories about my initial terror with stats, right? I hold up my old quick calculus book that I had to pick up at the bookstore the first day of math camp because for my graduate program, I've been running for math for 10 years, right? And I open it up and show pages where I had big question marks and wrote mean words, right, about this or that. Like, what in the world is this, right? Why do I do that? I want to get those, because then I tell stories about making a progression through it and realizing this and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to do is target those associations, right, and help them think about them differently, right? Say, you're in an early stage. I was exactly where you were at that stage. This is normal. I would hope that you would hate math right now. I would expect it, but you won't for long. That's an overstatement, but right? I also target those associations and try and reframe them for them. So as a political psychologist, I focus on framing a lot. I do a lot with. Anyone else in here do framing studies? Right? Yeah, Darren does. Right? I target those associations and then I say, look, when you think of stats, what I don't want you to fire up is your association with failed AP calculus in the high school. What I want you to think about is your success with learning a language. Stats is a language. It's not just math and all that type of stuff. It's a language. And then I have them share stories about their struggles with language learning and how they overcame. Right? That point where they were walking along the street, bemoaning their inability to speak the language, but they were doing it in the language, right? And their buddies turned to them and said, hey, you're actually pretty fluent in this language. And they realized it and all that type of stuff. I tell those stories. And I get them to tell those stories, right? I restructure the class. I say, look, stats is really just about difference of means. And so before I teach them any of the basics that should come first, like probability theory, we pull up a couple of my experiments that I motivate with stories, and then I show them difference of means and say, is that one higher than that one? Oh, it is. What does that mean? Wow, you're fantastic at stats. Right? Only after a while do I say, well, how can I be confident if I've got a sample if that one's higher than that one, right? Oh, how would we measure confidence? Let's talk about probability theory. Why do I do that? Simply because I'm trying to speak to those elephants. I want them leaning hardcore before we get to probability theory, and certainly before we get to regression. Right? I also spend time in every class period up front talking about my weekend, my life, my family, my kids, my wife. I encourage them to do the same. I know a number of you probably do that as well. Right? Why? Because I want that elephant to lead my direction. So this is a lot more than simply saying they don't care what you know until they know what you care. Right? That's part of it. But it's actively targeting those negative associations, recognizing them, recognizing the elephant in the room, so to speak, and then helping them repackage the way they think and feel, which is most important. Because I believe that if our middle students can feel that emotion pointing in the right direction, that they'll perform just as well as our top students. I just co-directed a London study abroad. It wasn't a study abroad, it was a research abroad where we went and we taught all the students stats and we taught them to stats in R, which has negative associations for many people, right? As a difficult language to learn. We specifically let in C and B students, believing there was no difference in ability, right? Just in motivation. Then the other director and I worked hard at speaking to their relevance. And some of the papers, the research that these C and B students conducted was remarkable. They're writing things that would be high A's in Poly 328 were they to go back, having received a C the first round. And I think the difference is motivation. So, now it's your turn. First, I'm interested in questions or comments on this. Yeah.
How do you even know like what the elephants are when it's more like the topical nature that turns students off rather than a skills set that they feel like they're lacking?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a great question. Any answers to that? How do you know what they are?
I would just add to that. I was fine until you said think of learning another language, and then I was just like, oh, I hate this.
Yeah, I know. I created negative affect right at the end of my. I had you.
Take me back to calculus.
Right. Then your alpha just went right. Okay. Well, the short answer is I don't know exactly, but I can guess, and especially over multiple semesters, I can guess from student comments. Here are the negative associations, right? That you're dealing with. And here are some ways that work better or worse at targeting them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So do you ever do a midterm evaluation where you try to get a hard number on what you think that their elephants are doing?
I do. Yeah, absolutely.
And does it work?
I have in the past. Well, just to get their rating of how they're feeling about the class.
Yeah. Are their elephants changing? You're swaying them?
Yeah, I do. I target the middle students in my class and I pull them into my office. And my goal is to see how are you emotionally thinking about this. You can do this, right? This is not, we're not teaching them something remarkably difficult, right, in Poly 328. But often that's my goal when I pull people in. I actually assign my TAs for that class to go out and specifically target people in their particular sections with that question in mind. How are people feeling about this? We can help them with the understanding if their elephants are leaning right, but if not, then we've got some additional work to do. So yeah, I'll do that type of stuff. Yeah, Quinn?
I think you provided an example of one potential answer to this question, which is that you take some time early on to listen.
Right.
And I think that goes against some of our instincts, which is we start by telling.
Yeah.
And if you take some time to listen, regardless of the topic, you're going to learn some stuff about where people are on that issue. But my question for you is different, though, and that is, as you alluded to, I think you're quite familiar with the literature that says that when you try to humanize other people, it can elicit a negative reaction.
Right.
And in the early part of your presentation, it sounded to me like you were trying to humanize stats.
Right.
And so, based on some of this research I'm quite fond of, that says that might backfire.
Right.
That I can imagine myself being one of these people with affect coming in, and then hearing you talk about how stats is just a language. Here's my math book. It's I hate it too.
Right.
And saying, wow, he's really going overboard to try to humanize this for me, but I'm digging in.
But I'm digging in, right? I hate it even more. Right.
I'm just wondering if what you do to avoid that.
Well, so my most recent research in London suggests that if you're able to craft your message such that you avoid triggering those negative associations, that you can actually see success. So in this recent stuff in London, we were actually able to humanize Muslim immigrants for the first time. And the way we did it is we carefully thought through the message and thought through the associations and tried to craft carefully. Now in a large classroom, you're going to get that right some of the time, and for some of the students and not for some of the other students. And so I just try to use like a shotgun approach, right? I'm gonna try and hit this one and that one and that one and that one that probably no one's ever cared about, right? In the chance that they might, and hope that on balance I'm getting more positive affect than I am negative. But it's a real challenge. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
What do you do when you have one or two elephants in your classroom that are louder and more negative?
And that refuse to lean? Yeah. So those elephants I pull into the office, and we talk, and I try to pin down their particulars. So I'll do targeted chatting with people. What is it about you in particular, right? What's driving that negative motivation? And we'll work on that individually, one-on-one. Doesn't always work perfectly, right? But I think as teachers and as leaders, because that's what teachers are, it's kind of passing the buck to say, well, the class would have been great except for so and so and so and so, right? I hear that from administrators periodically in time, not from our fantastic administrators here, right? But it's right. But I hear sometimes from administrators in other contexts, and they're like, well, it was personality X and Y, or this group of faculty had this or that, or this group of people, or there was a Sunday school class where so and so, and I say, you're the leader. You manage those elephants, right? And if not, then don't blame it on other personalities. I think you can get elephants to lean, generally, but it takes some targeted work at times. Yeah.
Does it help to call the elephants to their attention explicitly?
I think so.
And say, hey, you might have this. Think about that. Sort of a very meta kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's informing the rider that there is an elephant, right? You actually think you're in charge, but the elephant's taking you for a ride. Think about that, and here's what it means, and so on and so forth. I found success in some of my work, when we're talking about changing attitudes towards people, in just talking about the process. Because then people, and I find myself kind of consciously recognizing, oh, that was the lean. Let me think about that a little more consciously. I think that empowers writers a little bit. It's a great thought. So what I'd like to do, because we only have just a few minutes left, is I want you to get in groups. That wasn't our lesson today about managing group energy, right? But
My elephant's against that.
I know you're like, I hate group work. What I'd like you to do is just think about application. What does this mean in your particular? What are ways you can speak to the elephants in your particular classroom settings? Do we end at 45?
50. Yeah.
Or 50? Why don't we say 50? Does that get anyone's elephant go in the opposite direction? You can leave if you're okay, but
So you got 5 minutes.
but just take 3 minutes at most, and then I want to hear some of your ideas. I've just given you some of mine, but I don't really know what I'm doing, right? I'm just trying to figure this out, just like everyone else. But I'm interested in your thoughts. What are ways that you can speak?
Marketing technologist.
Yeah.
There's some very large elephants for that class. That's a hard class. Yeah, I because as a part of your purpose is sort of try to get students to think differently about all these kinds of things, right? Yeah. That are pretty great because So what do you think? I'm
We've got just 1 minute left.
Is this a social class or psych class? School of Life, Family Life class.
And I have none that I shared, I can say my trust, but I don't know that any of I don't think
Well, it's just like when we started, it's like most of what we do is just like, yes, exactly. Which
Okay.
is later.
So I'm interested in your ideas. What are some things that you already do, or things that you think, man, maybe I will do this? I'm interested in both.
We mostly described what we think the elephants might be, which might just be one step in the right direction, actually. But we had no solutions. We just, or ideas even. We just were describing the elephants.
I think that's a big
I
part
think
of
that's
it.
a good first step, maybe, is
Thinking
what I would
systematically.
say. Yeah.
Isn't there the old G.I. Joe quote, right? And knowing is half the battle. Is that G.I. Joe?
Was that you?
Yeah, it is.
I don't know. I have this vague recollection of something like that. Uh-huh. Yeah.
So we talked about, I teach very emotionally charged material in my class. So how I've approached this is by giving students a chance at the beginning of the class to just react to the reading in whatever way, hoping that I get some of that emotional reaction out and we can kind of clear the air a little bit. Is there anything about sort of like letting the elephants run free for a little bit?
Let the elephants sow their oats or trample their oats, I guess we would say. I don't know. I mean, are you finding that works well?
And at least help me recognize what the elephants are.
Right.
Instead of telling me that.
That's a great
I think
way.
There's some benefit to sort of
Yeah, that's a great way to
express
know.
it, and then we can sort of move on to the more academic parts of it.
It's kind of like taking a survey at the start. Which way are the elephants leaning here, right? And then you can address some of that. I like that.
So
So I think one of the other topics we were talking about is when you're teaching gender classes and difficult topics, you have elephants that are charged not only with their personal experience, but are charged in the gospel teaching. And if you're trying to teach more secular views, how do you handle that extra? You know, it's like you're getting the giant elephant instead of the
Right.
average elephant.
Right. And I think you can. And I think successful teachers do, but I think it's hard. I mean, it's certainly hard. Right. I mean, I think the title of Lisa's class is like all things that elephants might care about deeply.
It's Greek ethnicity of gender in American politics.
Yeah, right. You're like, gather your elephants and come. Right. That's what. And I know others of you are teaching similar things. Yeah. And
one of the things that came up in our group was that you need to know yourself, because not everybody's going to be as empathetic as you are. So you have to use your own personality, your own style in the class.
Right. This will look different for everyone. Right. It'll look different for everyone. Other thoughts?
I think there's options on that first day of class, especially after you've taught a class maybe 15, 20, 40 times.
Yeah.
You kind of have an idea of the elephants that are going to be there, and you can take an indirect way and just try to create a first day experience that blows away their expectations.
Right.
So that they go out of class going, wow, maybe I need to revisit my anticipated experience in this course. And then maybe the second day you can deal with that.
Yeah. So there should be associations that are triggered, but you're creating an experience that doesn't actually set off the associations.
And it opens their minds.
Yeah. Yeah. Bruce.
So do you do just a regular cookie cutter syllabus, or do you build this idea into the syllabus so as they're reading through this, they're starting to?
So I do a regular syllabus, but I never keep to it. And I tell them that up front. I say, look, here's our schedule. This is the order in which we're going to do things, but we're gonna take what time. I mean, I once took the first 20 minutes of a stats class and read There Was an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly with pictures. It turned the class around, but it was not on the syllabus. So I guess I'm thinking of the schedule. I try to in the syllabus writing, I try to frame things up in a certain way, right? But when I actually get into the schedule, we'll speed up and slow down.
But your wording that you introduce the class to
Right.
through the syllabus, you have already crafted that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, although I need to do much better at that. Yeah. So we're out of time, but thank you so much. This has been fun.